Welcome to QX Church. I'm Pastor Scott Conway, and today we are talking about Think on These Things. This is the first in a series. Philippians 4:8 is our text. Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, think on these things. Now you could dive in even just as simple a thing as beginning with emphasis. Think on these things. Focus your mind there. Or to think on these things. That these are the things you want to have consuming your mind. True, honest, just, pure, lovely, of good report, virtue, praise. Let these things be what occupies your mind. Now this is great advice. Now, this passage can be categorized more as advice than it is a command. I mean, it's not morally wrong to not be thinking of these things. And thinking on other things, of course, is also not morally wrong. So you wouldn't put this in the command category. But it is certainly good advice. You can categorize it as God's advice. God, in His Word, is telling us, hey, this is a really good thing to do. You want to be doing this. It'll make a positive difference in our lives. A positive difference in my life. A positive difference in your life. This is the sort of thing that we can talk to other people about. It doesn't matter if they're Christian. Because this is great advice. Now, what does think on these things mean? Think on these things. God provides us with a list and an admonition. Think. Now there's over a dozen Greek words that can be translated as think. And so when there's this selection of words, well, why pick this one? Is there a particular depth of meaning or a particular thing that this excludes or includes that might say this is the word? Of the dozen or more Greek words that can rightly be translated, I think this is the word. We can reasonably presume that this particular word was chosen for a reason. Perhaps, probably, because it most fully, most accurately, most completely encompasses what he means. Now, one of the problems any of us has, one of the problems, that God Himself has, is language is limited. One of the challenges God has trying to communicate with human beings is there's infinite heavenly concepts, and there's very limited finite minds. And how much of that vast truth can He communicate? Only as much as we're capable of understanding. Very often, there's only a handful of words that we would understand. And the full explanation would take too much. But in this particular case, there's over a dozen words to choose from. Now, is this the perfect word? Perfect in that there's nothing not included? Everything in this word is exactly what He means? Maybe. Maybe not. But certainly with a dozen choices, we can reasonably assume there's a reason the rest weren't chosen. And this one was. Because it's closest. Ambiguity and specificity are design features of the Bible. Sometimes God is ambiguous. Sometimes God says things where He has a choice in how to say things, and He's deliberately unclear. Now, how can we assume He's deliberately unclear? Because He could be clear. And He isn't. And he's God. So we assume if he's not being clear, it's on purpose. What he says can be interpreted in several different ways. And we believe that this is to help keep the main things the main things. It allows a particular culture, it allows a particular civilization, a particular slice of history to interpret the word or phrase in a way that suits their culture so they don't get bogged down on the small things and miss the big thing of salvation through Jesus Christ. But then there's the other side, specificity. Specificity also is a design feature. Because God is so often ambiguous about things, allowing a variation of interpretation, even if you look at the idea of giving specific examples, what does a specific example illustrate? That if I tell a story, how many principles could you pull from that story? If you change your point of view, could you pull different principles? Could it illustrate one thing as opposed to another thing? Like, here's a simple example. When the three sisters go before Moses to talk about inheritance, well, you have women going before their head of state. Does part of that story mean that God says women should have the authority to represent themselves before even the head of state at a time in history where women weren't allowed to do such things? Is it God saying, look, we are going to do this in an elevated way. We are going to be more honoring, more respectful than the cultures around us, more egalitarian. That whether you're male or female, and other stories that are told, whether you're slave or free, you have rights under God's law that you don't have in any other culture surrounding us. Could you look at something like the death penalty for homosexuality and say, see, God's against homosexuality, we need to eradicate it from the face of the earth? Or do we look at and say, okay, it's not allowed in here, but they never went to war with other nations and took them over and tried to eliminate it there. So can the story also illustrate that, this is a rule for our people that we can enforce among ourselves, but if someone says, well, then I just won't be a part of you, I'm going to leave and go over there, that we let them. And you see how you can go either way on a lot of things. That's part of why people will say things like, well, the Bible can be used to justify anything. Well, to a certain extent, that may be true, because the main thing is salvation through Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the main thing. And when you start getting the issues of salvation, the ambiguity goes away. When it becomes an issue of salvation, an issue of the crucifixion, an issue of Jesus Christ being here for us, in the four Gospels, that story's in all four. We get that in Acts. We get what we call the scarlet thread throughout the entire Bible. And the idea of the scarlet thread is that at any given page in the Bible, and they say without exception, depending how loosely you interpret it, but you can probably not get more than 2 out of 3 pages in the Bible without running into something that is in some way a prophecy of, an allegory to, or an outright description of Jesus Christ and salvation through Jesus Christ, that through faith in God, we will have salvation. That's the main thing. But then we have this kind of odd thing here. This is very specific. And if ambiguity is there so that the cultures that might disagree won't get bogged down on the side issue and focus on the main thing. And that if you come through the main thing, you come through Jesus Christ, a lot of those other things can slowly begin to take care of themselves. That if you truly have a relationship with God, if you truly walk in God's love, if you truly walk it out with the love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness and faith and self-control of a spiritual person, a lot of people's objections to some of these other more controversial things begin to fall by the wayside, and we begin to see, okay, if we filter our interpretation through the fundamentals of being spiritual, of love, of joy, then we begin to see like, oh, okay, without getting bogged down in the words. But then we have this. It's very specific. This is something that evidently, if ambiguity is installed in the Bible so that we don't get bogged down on side issues we might disagree with in different cultures and different moments in history, and this one is very specific. Part of the potential implication of that is it is so universal that there really isn't a rational basis to argue about it. It is so universal that at any time, in any culture, to any people group, at any time in all of history, this is great advice. Specificity is also a design feature, and this appears to be the latter. God chose a word which captures the fullness of what he means. The word think here is logizomai. Now, I can't tell you that my Greek pronunciation is really any good, but it's L-O-G-I-Z-O-M-A-I. Logizomai. This has a lot of deep meanings, and we're going to go over the various pieces of this momentarily, but it's think, impute, reckon, count, account, suppose, reason, number, compute, calculate, count over, deliberate, consider, meditate on, judge, determine, decide. That's a pretty good list. And to think on these things, now in English, on these things is 3 words. In Greek, it's the 1 word, tauta. These things, thus, that, these words, this. So basically, the stuff. Think on these things could have used any of more than a dozen Greek words that can be translated think. So, we'll assume that God uses logizomai because it most fully encompasses what he wants to communicate. That he wants us to think, impute, reckon, count, account, suppose, reason, number, compute, calculate, count over, deliberate, consider, meditate on, judge, determine, decide on things that are true, honest, just, pure, lovely, of good report, and have virtue and have praise. And he wants us, not just like, oh, yeah, interesting thought, a casual, let it in and out, but he really wants us to dive in at a different level. So let's take a look at some of this. Logizomai. Think. To intentionally focus your conscious mind to look at and ponder. Basically, it's pretty much what we think of when we say think. That's why in the translations they talk about think as one of the many parts of the meanings of logizomai. So to intentionally focus your conscious mind, that means you're doing it consciously. You're doing it on purpose. It doesn't just spring into your mind unbidden. You're thinking about something on purpose. You are looking at it on purpose. It's a conscious decision. You're pondering it on purpose. It's a conscious decision to ponder it. It's a conscious decision to look at it. It's a conscious decision to focus your attention there. Well, that's pretty basic, right? I mean, pretty much whenever you say think, that's what most of us think of when we say think. But there's so much more here, which is just interesting. Because another part of the logizomai is to reckon, to ascribe, to esteem or compute. Now, because we have compute showing up later, we can focus on to ascribe or esteem. To ascribe or esteem, what does that mean? We're going to reckon something. We're going to reckon something as true. We're going to ascribe truth to something. We're going to esteem the truth. And you can go, well, that's interesting, because why do you have to reckon something as true if it's true? Well, part of it is sometimes we don't reckon truth as truth. Sometimes we argue with the truth. And to reckon something as truth, maybe part of the deal is, instead of looking for what we disagree with, let's look at it and say, well, let's just, instead of arguing with it all the time, let's look at it and see if it is true. Let's think of it as true and see where that takes us. To ascribe truth to a thing, to esteem truth in a thing. And we're going to dive into all of this in much greater detail in the times to come. But if you think about to esteem the truth in a thing. Now, one of the things I'll say a lot of times when I'm teaching martial arts is that we do things our way for our reason. They do things their way for their reason. If our reasons are the same, there's a very good chance that the things we do will be the same. But if the reasons are different, there's a very good chance that things will be different. It's part of, I have a point. You may also have a point. We have a point. They may also have a point. And so if instead of just arguing with something that maybe you don't like, instead of focusing on where you disagree, maybe you can look at the truth in a position, the truth in a story, a truth that you can reckon, esteem, or ascribe. What would make it true? Sometimes people are surprised at how I handle people doing mean things to me. And there's one particular time 3 Christian women came after me, tried to destroy my work. And an atheist said, you see, that's what Christians do. Because that was his perception of what Christians do. And I was able to remind him, well, I'm a Christian. What do you think about how I'm handling it? He says, well, you're different. Well, different enough that he started coming to the Bible study and brought his atheist son after that. Now, he never accepted Christ, but his son did. But here's part of the ascribe, esteem, reckon. It says, if what these women believed was true, was actually true, what they're doing would be reasonable. Now, what they believe is true isn't true. We know it's not true. You know it's not true. I know it's not true. Giving them the benefit of the doubt. That if they really, seriously, honestly believe the words coming out of their mouth, then the things that they're doing make sense. Which, frankly, is as annoying as it is, sometimes I would prefer people to be making a mistake, but walking out what it is they say they believe, rather than someone who says a whole bunch of stuff, but the way they walk it out says that they don't really believe what they believe. So yes, that's really important. I'm just not going to spend any time doing it. Oh, yes, I love you. I'm just going to be really mean to you all the time. Oh, yeah, you're my good friend. I'm just not going to, ever be there for you. That at least for them, there is consistency between their words and their stated belief. You go, well, that might be an interesting application. And so we're at think, reckon, and then count. And then count doesn't count your blessings. Like, what's the number here? It's literally a count. 1, 2, 3, 4. So if you're going to think on things that are true, think on things that are of good report, just look at it, oh, there's another one. Let's put that one in the good report column. Look, we have all these things in the good report column. There's a technique called a Ben Franklin. Sometimes it's used in sales, it's used in decision making. The short version of what's called a Ben Franklin is you make a list, you cut a piece of paper in half, not really cut it in half, you draw a line down the middle of a paper. One side is pro, one side is con. And if you have more things on the pro side than on the con side, then you're for it. If you have more things on the con side than on the pro side, then you're against it. That you're keeping count. You're paying attention. Now, lately for myself, in this particular thing of counting your blessings, of just a number, is that I have been working on my albums, my photo albums. And recently I've been expanding my Dreams Done album, and then I have Dreams Done, which is basically the places I've gotten to go, experiences I've gotten to have. And then there's a Dreams or Dream Dining Done, which is memorable or meaningful places I've gotten to go eat. Some of them are memorable because they're really expensive and special. You would only go there for an uber special occasion. And some of them has nothing to do with the meal itself. It's the meaningfulness of the experience. Like there's an old place. It's a fairly inexpensive place, old style diner, and it's called Redford's. It's on the corner of 30th and El Cajon Boulevard. Very inexpensive place to eat. It's on my list. And you're like, well, Dream Dining Done. Why would a place like Redford's be on a Dream Dining list? And it's because of a lunch I had with my father and my grandfather when I was a kid. So it's on the list. There's a place called Nicolosi's that's on the list. And then, as you can probably surmise from the name, it's Italian. And why is that on the list? It's just an Italian food place. What's so special? I don't put all the Italian food places in there that I've ever eaten at. But that one used to be my dad's hangout when he was in high school, and it was up on El Cajon Boulevard. And then when I first moved out of the house, I lived on a street called Adobe Falls Road. And as it worked out from where my condo was, if you walk out the front door of my condo down to the parking lot, you turn left, and right across the street was Nicolosi's new location. I thought, well, that's pretty cool. My dad used to hang out there when he was a teenager and young guy. And now they're exactly the same place as my walking distance restaurant from where I live in my very first place of my own. So there's like multiple layered meanings there. So it's on the list. And then, of course, there's the super fancy places on the list. And what's going on in this? I'm counting my blessings. I have another list of dream show seen. And the dream show seen list also has this long list of fabulous shows I've gotten to go see. And so in the counting my blessings, just in this photo albums, and they're digital albums, and I'm printing them up and making physical albums and putting them up on the wall. But there's the number. I can look at the label for the album and see, like, I've got 78 things in here. Oh, look, I've got 240 things in here. That's counting. How many are there? Now, closely related to counting is account. So we have think, reckon, count, account. Well, what's the difference between counting and accounting? Accounting is counting and value. So when I dive into, say the Dream Dining Done, well, number-wise, Redford's is one thing. Dollar and cents-wise, it's one of the cheapest places anywhere in that list. But the value of it is disproportionate to the cost of eating there because of the memories attached to it. And that's part of accounting. Accounting isn't just, oh, look, I'm counting the things we have, and according to our list, we have one pencil. Oh, and look over here, and we have a car. Well, that's two different things. That's one and two. Obviously, the pencil's worth pennies, and the car is worth, presumably, thousands of dollars. Numerically, they're equal as far as counting them. But value-wise, they're enormously different. When I look at my dream show scene, one of the things in my dream show scene is Siegfried and Roy. I got to see Siegfried and Roy before Roy had his incident with the tiger. So part of what makes that show so valuable is it is impossible to go see that show anymore. It's gone. It was a great show. It didn't end because people were no longer interested. That it ended all of a sudden, completely by surprise, because of an incident. Siegfried and Roy was one of the most expensive shows on the Las Vegas Strip. In fact, when it first opened, it was the most expensive show. I think at the time it ended, the Cirque du Soleil show, O, at the Bellagio, was the only show that cost more money to go see. So there's the count, the number, and then there's accounting, the value. Now, some things are more valuable just because they cost more. Like there's, Nathan Burton Comedy Magic. I love magic shows. And that's a fairly inexpensive ticket. It's like, was $20, $25 to go see that. But then there's also David Copperfield, Lance Burton, Siegfried and Roy, the really high-end magic shows where tickets are $70, $100, $150. So accounting takes into account not just the number, but takes into account the relative value. And of course, as I'm illustrating here, the relative value might be the dollar value. How expensive was the ticket? It might be the meaning of it. That one of the least expensive restaurants in my Dreams Dining Done is also one of the most meaningful because I had a meal there as a kid with my father and my grandfather. 3 generations of the Conway line. Redford's is still there. My father died, almost 30 years ago now. My grandfather died something like 10 years ago. There will never again be a meal with my father. There will never again be a meal with my grandfather. Obviously, there will never be a meal with the 2 of them. And when I was a kid, I went to Redford's, down the street from my dad's business, and I had chicken fried steak for the very first time. And any time you see me eating chicken fried steak, you know I'm thinking of that day and those men. Think, reckon, count, account, and suppose. Suppose. To suppose is to assume a possibility. To assume a possibility. So when you're looking at things, you go, okay, think on things that are true, honest, just, pure, lovely, of good report, virtue, praise. Let's glance at honest for a moment. So to suppose. Suppose this person is being honest. Maybe I disagree. But what if we just suppose? Let's assume the possibility. So whatever actually is honest, but maybe I don't think it's honest, but they think it's honest. Well, what if it is honest? Just suppose. It's possible. Maybe they know something I don't know. Maybe they don't know something I do know, that they're being honest, but their honesty flows from the facts that they have, and that they don't have my facts. Maybe they're being honest as far as the facts that they have, and I'm being honest as far as the facts that I have, but I don't have their facts. Maybe neither one of us has each other's facts. So what if, instead of going, "You're lying," you go, well, what if they're being honest? What if they're being truthful? They're making true statements based upon the information that they have. That's supposing, to assume a possibility. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Is it possible? Let's just suppose. And when you begin to suppose possibilities, we call this giving someone the benefit of the doubt. Now, the way I phrase it is you want to give people the benefit of the doubt, the maximum benefit of the doubt, the totality of the facts allow. Now, here are a few keys in here. The maximum benefit of the doubt. How much benefit of the doubt can you give someone? And then here's a key. That the totality of the facts allow. You do not ignore facts. Because you have information. And when you give someone the benefit of the doubt, you take all that information into account. So say if I'm working with one of our kids, and I know this child has lied in the past. Do I give this kid the benefit of the doubt? Of course I do. But do I also take into account, I know this child has lied in the past. Because I know this child has lied in the past, I have to take that fact into account. While I may have a very general trust, I have to evaluate, is there a motive here to lie? And might a motive here to lie be somewhat close to a previously demonstrated willingness to lie? If someone is being judgmental, they have negative things to say about somebody, maybe they're exactly right. Maybe they're not. So let's suppose that they're right. Let's assume that possibility. But then I'll also suppose, what if they're wrong? Let's assume that possibility. If they have a demonstrated history of really being pretty accurate, and that you look at their history and go, you know, they're usually really careful with their words. They are not known for jumping to conclusions. They're known for drawing conclusions based upon the facts. And they have this really negative thing to say. Can you take that with great weight? On the other hand, what if they have a history of having jumped to conclusions, uttered negative things in the heat of the moment that goes far beyond the facts, drawn conclusions that are based on how they feel instead of based upon what is, and they have something really negative to say? Then would you have a different level of doubt? Because the totality of the facts gives you information. And you take into account all of the information. So you can go, okay, I assume right here, right now, when they say it, they mean it. But just because they mean it doesn't mean it's true. And based upon what their history is, and typically when someone gets judgmental and they take leaps, it might be emotionally driven. And so you might evaluate, say, okay, well, they're being emotional right now. They're being pretty intense. And whichever kind of intensity tends to lead to them being hyper-judgmental. And you're okay, so while they're in this intense state and they have these intensely negative things to say, that while I may be able to assume that they're being honest, that this truly is what they're thinking and feeling right now, that doesn't mean that I have to take it as factual reality, because I know they have a history in this kind of state to really overstate their position. So they use a lot of hyperbole. And I take into account that, you know, that this person does stuff like this. Think, reckon, count, account, suppose, and reason. To reason is to use logic. Now, there's a term, ratiocination. R-A-T-I-O-C-I-N-A-T-I-O-N. So, ratiocination. And it's to use logic. Logic includes deduction. That's when you have a general principle and you work out specifics based upon the general principle. Induction, where you work out the general principle from a number of specifics. There's something called subduction, which you could call the shotgun approach. You just kind of like throw everything out there and see what sticks. So logic isn't always this very systematic step 1, step 2, step 3, conclusion. That's induction. Deduction is, if this is true, then that tells us that that must be true, and that must be true, and that must be true, and that must be true. Induction is, if that is true, and that is true, and that is true, then this is the principle that illustrates must also be true. And it goes in all of the directions. It may start with what we call subduction, the scattergun approach. Like, well, here's all these different things, and there's this toss about, okay, well, let's say that one worked this way, that one, I don't know what happened over there. Okay, that one came out backwards. All right, so let's take the ones that are working, the ones that aren't working, and let's see if we can derive from what we see a higher level principle. That's induction. So, okay, now that we have this higher level principle, if this principle is true, then logically what else that wasn't part of our subduction scattergun approach, what else must therefore logically be true? And then you can say, okay, well, let's go see if it is. So the reason is to use logic. And so when you're using something, say, of good report, and you're going to logically look at something that is of good report. Say, okay, if this report is true, and if that report is true, and if this snippet is true, and that statement is true, and this thing happened the way they say it happened, what's the larger principle we see at work there? And if that's true, what else would be good that we haven't heard about yet? And we might just assume is true, or we might go find out is true. So coming up soon, I hope, I don't know yet, it's not on the schedule and I don't have the funds for it, but I hope I'm going to get to go to Disneyland. Suppose I've never been there before. In my particular case, I'm going to go see some things. It's been so long since I've been there, there's stuff there I haven't seen yet. But logically, I assume it's going to be pretty awesome. Now, what do I base that on? Well, I have all these data points of my Disney experience. And so I'm just going to assume that because that's awesome, that's awesome, that's awesome, this is a different kind of awesome, that's not my taste, but for people who like that, that's awesome. And so what do I see in there? That in general, there's a level of quality that I can reasonably expect from Disney based upon the experience. So then logically, that's the induction. That if this is what I can expect based upon my experience, that this new thing I haven't experienced yet is probably going to be a similar type of awesome. Now, what else do I know? Prices go up. Disney is expensive. Stuff costs a lot of money. That's been my previous experience. Can you go, well, maybe it's cheaper this time. Maybe they cut the prices in that. No, that'd be wishful thinking. That's something else on the negative side that I also know about this place. And and then there's a restaurant I want to go to, and it's considered premium dining. Well, based upon my premium dining experience inside the Disney parks before, at the Blue Bayou, next to the Pirates of the Caribbean, or Pirates of the Caribbean in Disneyland, I can assume, based upon my experience there, I logically agree, what's the principle? High-level dining, costs a lot of money, need to make reservations in advance, that this restaurant over here, even though I've never been there, I've never seen a price list, I've never seen how much anything costs there, I can probably assume that's going to be expensive, and I'm going to probably need to make reservations. How? I'm using logic. So what is a good report? Great food. Costs a lot of money. Great food. So what can I expect over there if I'm spending a lot of money? Great food. And that's just part of basic reason, basic logic. To number. To assign numbers or to total. It's very similar to counting. Counting is just how many are in there. To number something is to assign numbers and get a total. Sounds like it's pretty much the same thing, right? But if you think about it, if assign numbers like this is number 1, this is number 2, this is number 3, this is number 4. So getting back to my list, I have them grouped. And I can say, okay, this is the most important one. This is number 1. This is number 2. That's to number something. As distinct from counting, because we use those interchangeably. And so when both of them show up in a definition, you look, okay, what's the distinction? The count is just, well, how many are there? To number something also is, well, let's just kind of see how many there are. What's the total number that we have? And you can get there by counting. So you go, okay, so what else does number mean as distinct from counting? And that's to assign numbers. You could almost think about it as to put things in order. To make something number 1, to make something number 2. To number something can also involve a concept called a quality quantifier. And a quantifier is just you take something subjective and you make it objective. You assign a number to something. Now we do this in medicine where we say, okay, on a scale of 0 to 10 on pain, a 0 meaning that it doesn't hurt at all, a 10 meaning you feel like you're going to die. How much does it hurt? And that we get them to assign a number. Likewise, in a relationship, if we have a couple in the counseling office, we might say, okay, on a scale of -10 being, you're surprised no one got murdered on the way to the counseling session, to a 0 if you don't care if you stay married or not, up to a positive 10, like, oh my gosh, the fairy tales pale in comparison. Where are you? And that very often there's two relationships, that his experience of the relationship and her experience of the relationship are very different. Very typically what we see is that his number is higher than her number. Because very typically more of his needs are being met than her needs are being met. That's not all the time, but it's fairly typical. Now you might look at it as, well, that's because women are better wives than men are good husbands. Could also mean that women have much higher and more complex and inexplicable expectations than husbands. So, just because that's the way it often goes doesn't tell you any information. So don't take it as that one's better than the other, because both are involved. But when you're assigning a number to something, you can assign numbers to quality. And you can decide. You can decide what's going to be number 1. You can decide what's going to be number 2. When we do a values hierarchy workshop, what's your top value? You're making that number 1. Well, but it's a value. It's not like a sequence. What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about numbering something. It's part of thinking. And then we have compute. To compute is to determine by calculation. But we also have calculate, which is to figure out, to determine, and to evaluate. So when you're calculating something, you're going to figure it out. Let's look at it. What are all the pieces that have to go in here? Let's think about this. Let's kind of determine what is a part of this, what naturally flows from this. Let's evaluate it. Let's look at it carefully and calculate our way through, and then we can determine by the calculation, the determination based on that calculation, can we compute anything else out of this? What's part of this? How much can we learn as we make these determinations? What else might this mean as we dig into it and calculate what determinations can we make based upon those calculations? To count over. Well, to count over is to count again. To double check. You already counted it. You're going to count it again. You're going to double check what you're counting. You're going to go over it again. As part of counting something over, counting something again, double checking is maybe some of these things should be just dumped together. Maybe some of these things should be broken apart. I'm double checking it. I'm looking it over. I'm seeing if I missed anything. So if you went to my Dreams Done album 6 months ago, and you looked at my Dreams Done album as kind of the collected of the 3 albums, you go, well, you like tripled the stuff you have in here. When you counted over, when you went back through and you double checked, did you just find all sorts of stuff? Well, part of what I did in there is I made a decision that initially, it started when I got on Facebook in 2010, or somewhere thereabouts, and moved forward, and that's what was in there. And then more recently, I decided, you know what? I'm going to go back, and I'm going to include earlier things. Obviously, if I'm talking about Redford's Restaurant, when I was a kid, I've gone back way early. I backed up over 40 years to drop some of the stuff in this album as I've been reflecting on this. But as I count over, as I go over it again, as I double check, as I go and find my old vacation journals, I found my old vacation journal. Now this was a challenge because I recognized that when I found the file was in a word processing format that no longer exists. And I didn't have any software that could open that file, but there's information in that file. Fortunately, in this wonderful search engine age, I could go find something. It turns out I found a piece of software that was able to open it up, that didn't cost me any money, so I'm not going and spending $300 to open up this one solitary file. And I was able to open the file for read-only, but I could see what was in there. And I found a whole bunch of like, oh, wow, I forgot about that. I forgot about that restaurant. I forgot about that show. So I got to double check by comparing this list to that list, and oh wow, I totally forgot I saw that show. Think, reckon, count. Account, suppose, reason. Number, compute, calculate, count over, deliberate. Carefully weighed. Studied. Intentional. Now, because thinking in and of itself in the most basic translation is conscious, this level of intentional would imply then a different magnitude of focus. That I'm really going into this with intent. I'm really going in there with purpose. I'm studying it. I'm looking at it maybe for the details. I'm looking at it maybe for the bigger principles. I'm really immersing myself in some of the subtleties of it, things I might otherwise have missed. And I'm weighing it carefully. In this deliberation, because most things have some good and some bad, and carefully weighing it, deciding, okay, what weight am I going to ascribe? So we talk about accounting, it's what's the value. In deliberation and carefully weighing something, I'm carefully looking at the value of a thing. For accounting, it's like, well, how much is that? It's $18,000. For carefully weighing, it's $17,997.14. You're being very careful about it. When you're carefully weighing something, studying something, and going in there with a focused intent, what are you trying to find? What are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to conclude? Deliberation. To consider, carefully related to, closely related to this, to think carefully about, to reflect on. This is an interesting aspect of consideration. To make allowance for. So deliberation, you're carefully weighing. In consideration, you're thinking carefully about something. You're reflecting on it. Studying it is you're getting into it. You're looking at the details. If you think about studying a class, studying a subject matter, studying a book, studying a piece of art, studying a piece of music. And in consideration, it's to reflect on it. What does it mean? What does it mean to me? What's its place? What's its purpose? What's its application? What's its use? And then to make allowance for. Where might I let this go that it might not normally go by itself in my way of thinking? Maybe there's pieces of this that I need to let in that I might have thrown out with your classic throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Bathwater still needs to go. Need to keep the baby. Have I been trashing some of my treasure? Have I been treasuring some of my trash? Maybe I need to think carefully. Maybe I need to reflect on some of this. What does it mean to me? Does it mean anything about me? Do the choices I made mean anything about me? What am I discovering about myself? Do I want the truth to be different than it's been? Do I want to make allowance for certain things? Maybe to understand, well, you know, someone else is coming from a place of lack, a place of pain, a place of trauma. Maybe I can make allowance for that. But within the context of where they're coming from, this was all they could do. Maybe it's a matter of temperament. Maybe it's a matter of training. Maybe it's just a matter of talent. Maybe I need to make some allowances for those things. To meditate on. To meditate on, to deeply contemplate many aspects of. To dwell upon. Now, when you talk about meditation in a biblical sense, the metaphor commonly used is like chewing the cud. Like how some animals, they'll eat the grass, they chew the grass, chew the grass, chew the grass, swallow the grass, bring the grass back up, chew it some more. From a human level, that kind of sounds disgusting. But if you think about it intellectually rather than physically, well, you really ponder something. You deeply contemplate it, contemplate it, contemplate it. Kind of let it go, let it be in there somewhere. And at some point in time, you bring it back up and you contemplate it, contemplate it, contemplate it. And you dwell there. Very often and very naturally, we tend to dwell on bad things. I mean, that seems to be a natural human thing. And one of the reasons we may dwell on bad things and that we may be designed and engineered to dwell on bad things is bad things usually indicate a problem. And if there's a problem, our mind will naturally dwell on the problem. Why? So we can feel bad about the problem? Or so we can solve the problem? It's supposed to be so we can solve the problem. And once we solve the problem, should we keep dwelling on the problem? No, we shouldn't. We should be able to let it go. But very often, one of the reasons we haven't let it go is we haven't solved the problem. We haven't understood the problem. We haven't pulled out of it the wisdom that we need to pull out of it. And then just let go of the rest. It's done. It's over with. It's history. It's a fact of life. I've got a life to live. I can't be bogged down by the historical event. We're going to talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, what's going on there is that there was some trauma, and post the trauma, we have stress. Post-traumatic, so there was a trauma, is after the trauma, we have stress, and the disorder is that it's messing up our lives. So the disorder isn't that it doesn't make sense to have stress after trauma. That part makes perfect sense. There's absolutely nothing wrong with a brain that does that. We call it a disorder because it messes with our lives. It causes us to react to things we don't need to react to. It causes us to have a type of reaction we really don't need to be having. And that maybe what it is we developed as a reaction made perfect sense for survival at the time of the trauma. Maybe that reaction, that overreaction, that different reaction would work to keep us alive, to help us cope, to help us deal, to help keep us safer. But that no longer applies. It's done, it's gone. And to meditate on is to deeply contemplate many aspects of it and to dwell upon it in a positive way. Okay, what do I need to learn from there? What do I need to let go? If you have the skill set to let go, then let it go. If you don't have the skill set to let it go, learn the skill set to let it go. Use 5-step forgiveness. If that kind of stuff keeps coming up, use the Triple E Freedom Technique. If you don't know those, we have programs for those. Those are in books. Those are available to you. And when it comes to some of the stuff like that of being able to deeply contemplate many aspects of both the positive and the negative, to really think on the things, to see the negative and the positive, to see the positive and the negative, to be able to extract the treasure and then be able to dump the trash. So that way you get to go forward with more treasure and you don't have to keep carrying around the trash. But I've actually had people literally sit down with a yellow pad all by themselves. Once they got good at it, they no longer needed any guidance to help lead them through the steps. And they sat down with a yellow pad and they literally would write out old traumas. And then they would get up, walk around, and they would talk it out loud. Because they knew the technique. And as they meditated on some of these things, they said, okay, there's some great wisdom to be learned here. There's some great skills to be learned here. And once I extract all of the treasure emotionally, there's no reason to keep the trash. I don't need it to protect myself. That danger isn't here anymore. And I'm letting it go. And then they can deeply contemplate the many aspects of the things of virtue, the things of praise, and dwell upon the good things. Because in the meditate on, this isn't the unbidden sort of being stuck in something that happens so naturally. This is on purpose. Well, on purpose, I'm not going to go focus on the trauma unless I'm going to go deal with the trauma. On purpose, I'm going to go focus on wherever there is praise, wherever there is virtue, the things of good report. And that's meditate on. And to deeply contemplate these interesting things. To really dwell on the good stuff, to steep myself in it, to really savor it, to infuse this into my life, and to infuse myself into the best. Then to judge. Well, this isn't to be judgmental of. The judge as part of the think of the logos of mind is to form an opinion, to draw a conclusion. That you're deciding what something means. You're deciding what you think about it. When you're drawing a conclusion, you say, okay, I have all my information. Here's my conclusion. Notably, it's to form an opinion. Now, what's curious is even in our legal system, a judge issues an opinion. Legally, it's treated as the truth, but it's still called an opinion. And the reason is, logically, because we don't know for sure, but based upon what I've seen, based upon the evidence, this is the opinion of those who have looked at the evidence presented to them. So when you're thinking on things, you form opinions about things. When you're thinking on things, you draw conclusions based upon the information that you have. Not in a reactionary way, in a thoughtful way. And determine. So we have think, reckon, count, account, suppose, reason, number, compute, calculate, count over, deliberate, consider, meditate on, judge, and now determine. To determine is to investigate and decide. And decide comes in a moment. But to investigate and decide. To look for missing information. To be even just aware of fact gaps. Right now there's a big item in the social media news that isn't a big item in the mass media news. Well, what that means is the information that we're getting is very, very skewed. Now, as much as people might say that the mass media is biased, and that they don't just represent the one side. They might kind of skew one side, but both sides are there. They might pretty obviously favor one over the other, but they do try to present both sides, even if they seem to obviously favor one side. It's just the side that they don't want to talk about that much might just get a little bit of a mention. The old newspaper thing is it might get buried on page 5 when it really should be on page 1. But it's there. Right now what we're getting is just the one side's opinion, the one side statements, and only the statements of those who believe in their side strongly enough that they're getting on and they're sending out this information. Well, I'm looking at it and thinking, I'm missing so many pieces of information here. I can't draw a conclusion because I don't have data. I have massive fact gaps. So no, I can't pick a side because I don't have the information I need. I only have partial information only from one side. It's not just that I only have information from one side. The one side's information is only partial information even for that own side. So I can't draw a conclusion. It's like when you listen to a kid tell you his version of the story. Can you draw a conclusion if you haven't talked to the other people involved yet? You know, how many times does whoever this gremlin is called Not Me does something in people's houses? He gets around. Who did it? Not me. You don't know. It seems to be a reflex. And that if you're going to investigate, you have to recognize I have fact gaps here. There's chunks of stuff where I don't know. I need to investigate before I can decide. To determine is also to settle, to cause, or to affect, not to effect, to affect. Meaning I'm doing something. So a determination in this definition includes to settle something. So maybe you've investigated and you've drawn your conclusion, or you're settling something. You're reconciling some stuff. And you're deciding, okay, this is what the deal's going to be. And you may have to just live with the fact gaps. And given the fact gaps, that this is kind of what my conclusion is going to be. This is what I've determined. And this is how loosely I have to hold it because I don't have all the information. And sometimes you might do best guess, because you really don't know. What if you're trying to figure out why your parents behaved the way your parents behaved? If I'm trying to figure out why did my dad do what my dad did, well, I don't know, who am I going to ask? My father's dead. He's been dead for 30 years. Maybe my grandmother and grandfather might be able to shed some light. But both of them are dead too. My grandmother died years before my father died. And so the people that might know the stories might not know. And so I just kind of settle it to myself that in my investigation I have these massive fact gaps. And I'm just going to kind of settle into a place where I'm just going to accept that there's probably something that makes it make sense. Could be something like this, could be something like that. I don't really know, but the issue's settled. I'm not going back to it anymore. All I have is fact gaps. There's no way to get the information. So I'm just going to settle it. Then we have this interesting to cause and to effect. To make a determination, to determine that now you're going to take this information and use it in some way, to cause some kind of outcome, to put a cause in motion, to have an effect later on, and an effect, to affect something, to do something that's going to make a change, to somehow make use of this true, honest, just, pure, lovely, good report, virtue, praise thing, to affect something. Maybe to take whatsoever things are lovely and decide I'm going to include it in my home or my business. I'm going to make it more attractive, more beautiful. I'm going to make my life more beautiful by affecting my life, by affecting my workplace, by affecting my home with this stuff. As I have pondered, what is of good report? What is lovely? And finally, decide. To think is to decide. To cut off other options. I've decided that I've been thinking about that whatsoever things are true. And I'm going to cut off what's false. I'm going to stick to what's true. Or decide on honesty. I'm going to stick with what's honest. I'm going to cut off the dishonest. I'm going to stick with what's just, cut off the unjust. I'm going to stick with what's pure. I'm going to cut off the defiled. I'm going to stick with what is lovely. I'm going to cut off the ugly. I'm going to stick with what is of good report. I'm going to cut off what is a bad report. I'm going to stick with the virtue. I'm going to cut off the vice. I'm going to stick with the praise. I'm going to cut off the insult. I've decided. I'm cutting off other options. To conclude, I've looked at it. This is my conclusion. I'm taking action on this. To choose. I choose this. This has been my menu of options. This is my choice. Think on these things. Whatever things are true. Whatsoever things are honest. Just, pure, lovely, of good report. If there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. Think, reckon, count, account, suppose, reason, number, compute, calculate, count over, deliberate, consider, meditate on, judge, determine, decide. On these things. On which things? Whatsoever is true, honest, just, pure, lovely, of good report, and where there is virtue, and where there is praise. Think on these things. Think on these things. Thank you.